guests. This is Felix Beltran, former student. You can read he's a former McNair scholar. He's currently a PhD candidate in political science with an emphasis on comparative political economy at Purdue University. So he took his Eastern degree and went on to a fellowship and a PhD program at Purdue. And Felix has been absolutely essential to this research that I do. And without Felix, this event would not happen, nor would I have any real contacts in Mexico, in Hermosillo, for example, his homeland, his hometown. I want to give thanks to my department, the Department of History, Anthropology, Modern Languages and Literature. Most importantly, our fantastic chair, Dr. Michael Zukowski. I don't see him, but he's on his way. He's out there. Oh, there he is. Thank you, Michael. Provost Jonathan Anderson has also been really jazzed about this project for a long time, and he's given a lot of support. I'm also hugely grateful to Miss Jasmine Jackson in the college office. She's the one who designed the really cool promotional materials you've seen and has spread the word about this event. I'm going to introduce the panelists to you right now really, really briefly, and we'll have deeper introductions of them as we go along. First, we're going to hear from an individual named Jose Gabriel Roman Madrigal, a friend and partner I have who works for the Ministry of Housing and Human Settlements in Costa Rica. And you'll hear a lot about his story and the work that he does with people who live in informal communities. We will meet César del Pardo Escalante, a delegate for the Central Unitaria de Vivienda, the United Housing Center, based in the states of Sinaloa and Sonora, Mexico. You'll also hear his life story and see the kind of work he does to help people formalize their holdings in informal settlements. We're delighted to have Terry Anderson, who is Spokane Director, Lead-In Policies for the Tenants Union of Washington State. We are delighted to have Ben Stuckert, Executive Director of the Spokane Low-Income Housing Consortium. And lastly, Mr. Brian Jennings, Development Director of the Spokane Housing Authority. So let's give all of our panelists a hand right now. And thank you all again for coming, and I hope you enjoy the presentations. So, adelante. We can start with the first video.
Hablar un poco sobre de ti, de dónde es usted y cómo es que ha llegado a su posición actual en el Ministerio de Vivienda.
Ok, vamos a ver. En términos generales, yo puedo decir que yo soy un fruto del Estado social costarricense, en términos de que yo vengo de un hogar relativamente pobre, que mantiene niveles de la posibilidad de acceder a mis diferentes niveles de educación. Me permitió pues, encontrar un poco la salida del esfuerzo de mis padres, las posibilidades sociales que construyeron. O sea, yo soy una persona que he tenido 3 formaciones. Completamente mi situación. Dentro de esta dinámica con el Frente, yo paso a organizar una toma de tierras en un sector que se llama Comunidad de Paz, Finca San Pedro, y a partir de ahí, digamos, yo vivo 3 años en ese hospital y ahí tomo una decisión también que cambia un poco mi vida en el sentido que yo digo, bueno, ya viví la sociología, entonces ahora quiero estudiar. Entonces, un poco como digo, me meto a estudiar sociología para entender un poco las dinámicas sociales que está viviendo. Imagínense un estudiante de agronomía o un agrónomo metido en esta dinámica. Y como digo, tal vez no, con la sociología no encontré respuestas, pero al menos precisé las preguntas. Concluyo mi ciclo con el frente y en ese momento también me caso, en posactual, y empiezo a retomar un poco las rutas que decido, me ofrece una oportunidad de venirme a trabajar al Ministerio de Vivienda en el año 89 y desde entonces, bueno, he tenido otros trabajos, pero básicamente entro acá y a partir de ahí también inicio posteriormente a partir de estudios en materia de la maestría en geografía, termino acá sociología e inicio una maestría en geografía con énfasis en ordenamiento territorial, que es un poco la situación que me maneja. Entonces te puedo decir, te voy resumiendo para no hacerlo exageradamente largo, yo soy una persona que puedo resumir en 4 énfasis. Yo soy autogobierno por naturaleza, yo soy un viviente comunitario que en ese aspecto viví intensamente la dinámica del turismo. En segundo lugar, una persona que se procuró una formación académica, me tuvo las posibilidades que el Estado Social costarricense y el esfuerzo de los padres me lo proveyó en ese sentido. Tengo 3 carreras, una de agrónomo que no ejercí, pero que había una formación en una de sociólogo y una maestría en geografía de ordenamiento territorial. Una tercera fase.
Es el fenómeno del precarismo en Costa Rica, en otras partes de las Américas, que nos interesa. ¿Y cómo se define el precarismo en Costa Rica? ¿Qué es eso?
Ok, vamos a ver. Cuando hablamos de precario, uno puede valorarlo desde diferentes niveles y desde diferentes enfoques. Si lo vemos desde una posición estrictamente legal, el precarismo refiere a la situación donde una persona o una familia o un grupo de familias toman un terreno que no es de su propiedad y le dan un uso residencial o otro uso. Entonces, precario está en condición precaria aquella persona o aquella familia o aquel grupo que realiza un uso residencial o otro uso de un terreno que no es de su propiedad. En ese sentido, las causas del precarismo serían multifactoriales, son muchas causas las que pueden llevar a esta situación, pero además son multisectoriales. Por ejemplo, ¿a qué me refiero? No es una condición dentro de la definición estrictamente legal que afecta que define solo a familias en pobreza. En Costa Rica sería una situación un poco paradójica. El Estado, por ejemplo, compró a precios muy altos, digamos, algunos terrenos para desarrollo de calles, de alguna otra actividad desarrollar, y por diferentes razones, las familias reciben dinero, pero no abandonan la propiedad. En ese sentido, que podemos hablar de familias de nivel de ingreso alto que están en una condición precaria, ¿no? Por señalar ese tipo de situación. En este momento, en una de las zonas, acá en una de los cantones costeros de Costa Rica, hay un fenómeno de invasión de clases medias muy significativo en algunos terrenos que incluso están en este momento igualmente muy distinguidos por propiedad. Entonces, digamos que en ese sentido, precarismo desde el punto de vista estrictamente legal es básicamente un conflicto de tenencia de la tierra. Ahora, desde el punto de vista social.
Muchas gracias, profesor Madrigal. Un placer, la verdad, y gracias por su tiempo, profesor Román Madrigal. Quería preguntarle acerca de la toma de tierra. Se me hizo interesante lo que acaba de comentar. O sea, el sistema o la manera de ser precario es que lleva a tomar a esta toma o esta posesión de terrenos, digamos, irregulares o que no son propiedad de estas personas. ¿Cómo se lleva a cabo esta toma de tierra? Sería mi primera pregunta. Y también, ¿cómo son los métodos, digamos, de organización social, digamos, de individuos, de familias, para organizarlos a llevar a cabo de esta, y tal vez las tácticas al mismo tiempo que se llevan a cabo para esta toma de tierra?
Ok, vamos a ver. ¿Cómo nace tu culto? Vamos a ver. El tugurio puede nacer espontáneamente. Socialmente esa palabra no existe, pero bueno, pero vamos a ver. ¿Cómo puede originarse un tugurio? Básicamente, una familia o un grupo de familias ingresa a un terreno y posteriormente puede haber sucesiones de familia que sigan en este proceso. O sea, en ese sentido, digamos, no, sin necesariamente que medie un nivel de organización bien establecido dentro de esta situación. No es el fenómeno más común ahora en Costa Rica, es un fenómeno que tal vez pudo haberse dado en realidad de los 70, 80, ¿no? Perdón, antes de los 70, donde digamos, la familia llegaba a un terrenillo urbano ahí que tal vez nadie interesaba y después se trajo a alguien al lugar. A nivel rural hemos visto algunos de estos fenómenos de asentamientos que van en ese tipo de formación, pero digamos no es lo usual. Lo usual en Costa Rica, básicamente, es que la precarización o los fenómenos de precarización han seguido dos nortes, digamos, dentro de esta situación. Un primer norte es una precarización que es organizada por grupos organizados, valga la redundancia, y que estos grupos, digamos, preparan y definen una toma en un lugar. Un documento publicado alrededor en los años 70, que cuando se dio dentro del Frente Democrático de la Unión, el que iba a invadir o que estaba invadido tenía tres preocupaciones esenciales e inmediatas. Un poco el tamaño del terreno, que era una situación importante dentro de esa situación. Un segundo elemento que era completamente definitorio era que hubiera agua, era una condición sine qua non ahí para que estuviera desarrollado. Y tres, que básicamente, si el terreno era privado, que el dueño tuviera más o menos anuencia que se le iba a invadir y que lo dejaba. O si no, básicamente lo que se buscaban eran terrenos públicos. Para destacar lo siguiente, las invasiones que se dieron en la década de los 70 y 80 tuvieron una lógica de vivienda. Es decir, yo invado esos terrenos bajo la lógica que en esos terrenos el Estado me iba a dar vivienda. De ahí un poco la preocupación por mantener niveles de densidad aceptables, de ahí la preocupación por tener ciertas condiciones y ciertas facilidades previas en la situación. Esa no es una situación que actualmente existe. Entonces, yo invado finca San Pedro bajo la certeza de que una vez que se consolida esta invasión, ahí se va a hacer un proyecto de vida.
Entonces, ¿cómo es la vida cotidiana del precarista? ¿Qué retos se enfrentan diario? ¿Y qué hace usted para abogar a su favor, para mejorar las condiciones de su vida?
Ok, vamos a ver. Un primer punto de partida en términos eso me llevó a pelearme un poco en algún momento con algunos compañeros de mismo marxista que son, vamos a ver, el precario tiene una connotación en el sentido de que a nivel de vida cotidiana la característica fundamental del precario y sobre todo cuanto más tiempo tenga una familia viviendo en esa situación más fuerte y más arraigado va a ser ese fenómeno, se vive en el corto plazo. Y eso genera dificultades en el orden social, en el orden político, en el orden económico, muy complejos con estas familias. ¿Qué pasa en el precario? ¿Qué pasa en el seguro? La gente vive día a día. Yo como lo que me gano hoy. Yo como, yo trabajo, yo hago el esfuerzo, digamos, yo vivo en una situación de lo cotidiano, de lo inmediato, en ese tipo de cosas. ¿Qué connota esto, por ejemplo, desde el punto de vista político? Si uno se pone en una situación importante en términos de definición, y se los pregunto a ustedes, por ejemplo, que ustedes fueran candidatos políticos, ¿no? Uno de ustedes ofrece comida y el otro ofrece educación, ¿por cuál votaría la gente en precario? Evidentemente por el que le está dando la comida mínima. Ese inmediatismo de la gente, lamentablemente, ofrece muchas posibilidades para su manipulación y su ingreso.
Entonces, ¿precarismo es un problema de inmigrantes o es un problema de costarricenses o los dos?
Vamos a ver. Primero que todo, la primera característica del precarismo en la condición que estamos viendo en este momento es pobreza. O sea, es la incapacidad que tiene un amplio conjunto de la población de poder dotarse de suelo calidad para darse un albergue digno. Esa es la primera característica que nosotros tenemos que tener claro dentro de esta situación. En el caso de la señora, marca una particularidad muy importante, que ella es nicaragüense, pero la hija es costarricense. Entonces, vamos a ver, entonces, voy en orden de ideas. Tienes un primer elemento de pobreza. ¿Qué te lleva a la pobreza o cuáles son los elementos que determinan la pobreza? Pueden ser elementos estructurales, o sea, todo elemento dentro del sistema social y económico que desarrolle la pobreza va a desarrollar precario, o va a desarrollar estas fórmulas porque la gente simplemente no se lo va a proveer. Otra forma incluso de tuburización que un poco está poco estudiada, poco lo hemos analizado, por ejemplo, es el deterioro de las viviendas por desatención, por incapacidad de la familia de poder brindarle a las casas sus mínimos de atención. Y pues a lo largo del año yo vi, por ejemplo, en las islas del Golfo, casas que estaban, algunas de las paredes que estaban sostenidas por tucas de entonces, pobreza, un poco dentro de esta situación, políticas sociales. ¿Cuál es la capacidad que tiene el Estado de darle oportunidades para estas familias? Determina mucho ese tipo de condición. Tercero, la condición de migrante. Y cuando hablamos de condición de migrante, el problema no es migrar. Porque cualquiera de nosotros puede migrar y las condiciones serían muy diferentes. Normalmente la migración ilegal, llegar el elemento de que esta familia llegue y esté indocumentada, lo que limita las posibilidades de poder mostrar y poder existir su situación. Muchos de ellos viven bajo el temor permanente de si en algún momento los puedan deportar o sacar de acá. Y aquí se marca un derecho que en algún momento lo vi en una situación, que era el derecho a no migrar. La situación de las familias de no verse obligadas a migrar por situaciones económicas o sociales o políticas dentro del país. En términos de migración, sí es claro, existe un contexto adelante. No puedes hablar de un fenómeno puro de migración. En Costa Rica eso no existe. O sea, decir que aquí eso es un problema de nicas, es un problema de no. El caso lo ves ahí, constitucionalmente, todo hijo de un extranjero nacido en Costa Rica es costarricense con nacimiento. Entonces, por ejemplo, una de las estrategias normales del migrante es tener hijos costarricenses. O simplemente porque el migrante típico es una persona, el migrante económico es una persona en plena capacidad reproductiva y productiva. En ese sentido, vienen muchachos nicaragüenses en plena capacidad, se pueden enrolar con costarricenses y forman hogares mixtos o quedan embarazadas y quedan con un niño costarricense. Eso es una situación completamente normal, no existe. Y un último elemento dentro.
Hay otras diferencias importantes entre esos dos países.
Mira, obviamente también tengo que reconocer que conozco poco de la forma como se estructura la política social en Estados Unidos, y además me parece que varía mucho a veces de un estado a otro. Pero a mí me parece fundamentalmente dentro de esto ha habido una situación básica, la diferencia sustantiva para mí está en que el Estado de Costa Rica procuró crear una base social, una base institucional de apoyo a las familias en pobreza. Con sus más y sus menos que uno pueda existir, poniendo la existencia de fondos como lo que se llama FODESAT, el Fondo Social de Desarrollo de Asignación de Familia, que crea un fondo a partir de un impuesto que se genera a los empresarios y que se constituye en una base importante. Eso es clave. Es decir, la existencia de una institucionalidad y una visión social del compromiso del Estado hacia determinados sectores de menores recursos se da. Yo pienso que tal vez es una visión periodizada, pero me da la impresión de que en Estados Unidos tiene una tendencia a buscar la resolución vía mercado, la alternativa vía mercado, y que en ese sentido obviamente eso limita muchísimo las posibilidades de las familias de poder resolver sus problemas. Digo, pues, es una visión, digo, totalmente limitada. Pero en general digo, es decir, a mí me parece que frente a un problema de pobreza, si no hay una acción decidida del Estado de intervenir y tratar de apoyar, me parece que es difícil que desde la sociedad, desde el Estado o cualquier otra situación pueda resolverse este tipo de situación. Y la experiencia de Costa Rica un poco pareciera que lo marca en esa dirección. En la medida que el Estado ha venido declinando en el tema de la vivienda, los problemas han venido presentando.
Thank you, Jose. We will hear from Jose at the end of the presentation. The next presentation switches gears, looking at a similar but different situation in Mexico. And we'll hear from César del Pardo Escalante, who I mentioned was a delegate for the states of Sonora and Sinaloa for the Central Unitaria de Vivienda, the Unitary Housing Center. So I should mention, if you have any questions, for those of you on Zoom, pose them into the chat box. I'll collect them and we'll give them to the panelists at the end. As well as we'll go around and do some live Q&A at the end of the presentations. Thank
you. ¿Puedo tomar la palabra?
Sí, César.
César, todavía no.
César, sí.
Gracias. Y en cuanto a la segunda parte de la pregunta, que viene siendo la movilización, ¿cómo se lleva a cabo esta movilización? Obviamente, ya lo que usted acaba de explicar conlleva a qué lleva a estas personas llegar a esa situación de precariedad. Ahora, ya que están en este estado de precariedad, ¿cómo es que se unen? ¿Cómo es que llegan ellos a tener esta unión a través de su organización? ¿Y cómo es que llevan ellos a movilizarse y ver resultados?
Bueno, lo que nosotros hacemos, hay muchos líderes que integran la Central Unitaria de Vivienda.
Y en cuanto a la segunda parte de la pregunta, que viene siendo la movilización, ¿cómo se lleva a cabo esta movilización? Obviamente, ya lo que usted acaba de explicar conlleva a qué lleva a estas personas llegar a esa situación de precariedad. Ahora, ya que están en este estado de precariedad, ¿cómo es que se unen? ¿Cómo es que llegan ellos a tener esta unión a través de su organización? ¿Y cómo es que llevan ellos a movilizarse y ver resultados?
Bueno, lo que nosotros hacemos, hay muchos líderes que integran la Central Unitaria de Vivienda y muchos tienen una gran experiencia, ¿no? Entonces saben organizar los movimientos de reclamo social. Por ejemplo, esa foto que tienen ahí es una reunión donde este compañero acaba de fallecer de COVID precisamente. Era un terreno que el ayuntamiento de Guatabampo ya lo tenía destinado a vender a una empresa. Era un terreno destinado para vivienda. Cuando nosotros estudiamos, analizamos y vimos la situación legal del terreno, lo que optamos fue meter a la gente al terreno, porque había elementos legales que nos permitían quedarnos con ella, que era un terreno que fue adquirido para un fin específico que era para vivienda de interés social. Entonces nos quedamos, nos organizamos, resistimos y negociamos. Ahorita ese terreno ya está en un franco proceso de regularización, ya se empezaron a entregar los títulos. Entonces la organización, eso es lo que hace, ¿no? Buscar este espacio donde podamos nosotros garantizarle un lugar donde vivir a la gente, hacer un estudio serio sobre la legalidad, las condiciones de movilidad social, que la movilización social es la garantía para abrir las negociaciones con las autoridades correspondientes.
Solamente para clarificar para la audiencia, cuando usted menciona que ya está en proceso de regularización y cuando se hizo el movimiento de traer a las personas, no estamos hablando de que los terrenos se han dado gratuitamente, sino que estos eran, primero que nada, era un terreno que era para vivienda popular, que después se trató de cambiar a un particular o entregarse a una corporación, por lo cual ustedes decidieron invadir ese terreno porque era destinado previamente a este tipo de trabajo. Pero aún así, los terrenos y la titulación no se da gratuitamente, es porque las personas empiezan a dar sus cuotas mensuales, ¿no? para obtener esos terrenos, ¿es correcto?
Sí, pero se compran muy baratos, o sea, lo que nosotros hicimos, como el terreno fue expropiado, lo que nosotros planteamos es que no se les cobrara el suelo, sino las escrituras nada más. Por ejemplo, en este caso, las escrituras por terreno ya como propio va a salir más o menos en $500 o $10,000. Y un terreno que ya puedes construir.
Perfectamente, muchas gracias. Ahora, eso solamente lleva o conlleva a la primera fase, o sea, ya se tiene el terreno porque ya los particulares ya ingresaron, ya empezaron a construir. Pero eso solamente crea lo que es 4 paredes y un techo, por así decirlo. Pero también tiene que llevar a otros servicios de luz, de agua, drenaje. Poco a poco esos servicios se van llevando también y se tienen que ir negociando. ¿Es eso lo que hace usted con su organización? No solamente la vivienda en sí, de las 4 paredes y el techo, sino lo que hace de un lugar o de un edificio una vivienda, que viene siendo todos estos servicios públicos.
Sí, de hecho, cuando se escritura la dependencia que nos vende el terreno, se los tiene que entregar al municipio en mención, en este caso Guatabampo, y ellos se encargan de introducir los servicios públicos. Y sobre la construcción, nosotros tenemos proyectos de autoconstrucción. Por ejemplo, ahorita estamos organizando bloqueras en varias partes del país para que la gente pueda acceder a material barato.
Hemos llegado al grano. ¿Qué puede hacer los precaristas, por ejemplo, para prevenir el desalojo? Si el gobierno, si una terrateniente, por ejemplo, quiere desalojarlos.
Mira, nosotros ya tenemos mucha experiencia en esto. Por ejemplo, a mí me tenían una página web para estarme calumniando. La hicieron la página web para estarme diciendo que hacíamos fraudes y usan una serie de bots y todo eso, ¿no? Para en las publicaciones mantener y en un tiempo lo hicieron con otros líderes, ¿no? ¿Por qué? Por una razón. Por ejemplo, cuando ellos compraban vivienda o la siguen comprando, si demandaban a Juan López por despojo, nosotros desalojábamos a esa familia y metíamos a otra que no era Juan López. Y entonces ellos se veían obligados a iniciar un nuevo juicio. Entonces, los cargábamos, digamos, en el sentido coloquial, locos. Pero nosotros checábamos el proceso prácticamente cuando estaba llegando a sentencia. Era cuando les alojábamos a la persona y metíamos otra familia. Y los procesos duran 3 años. Entonces tendrían que esperarse otros 3 años. En esos 3 años, muchas de estas empresas desaparecen porque también quitan la figura legal porque evaden el fisco. Entonces, a veces hemos recurrido, por ejemplo, a amparos federales y también detenemos los desalojos, obligamos, por ejemplo, al Infonavit, ahí sí, si la persona vive ahí, a que reestructure la deuda, incluso cuando están en sentencia. Entonces, hemos tenido, digamos, un movimiento exitoso en cuanto evitamos los desalojos. Por ejemplo, a nosotros nos estorba mucho más tratar con los estados y con los municipios o con el mismo Infonavit nacional, porque la burocracia y la visión que ellos tienen de la vivienda expansiva choca con la realidad. Entonces, para nosotros es más fácil organizarnos sin el apoyo del Estado, porque el Estado todo el tiempo se ha convertido en un obstáculo para nosotros, y lo hemos hecho bien. Por ejemplo, en Sinaloa, nosotros nos posesionamos de 12,000 viviendas, y en Hermosillo, por ejemplo, 5,000 viviendas. En Colima, yo calculo que en 2 años agarramos 2,000 viviendas, y así sucesivamente en cada estado. Pero voy a dar un dato: en Sinaloa solamente tuvimos como 12 demandas de carácter penal, es decir, el 1%. En Hermosillo, de 5,000 tuvimos más o menos 28 demandas, o sea, prácticamente nada, pues, es decir, lo hacemos de una manera que protegemos al solicitante para que no sea violentado en su derecho. Y de alguna manera esto ha permitido que los estados volteen a ver el problema de las viviendas, el conflicto de la vivienda. Por ejemplo, el gobernador de Baja California Sur, yo me reuní con él hace un mes, no me acuerdo muy bien, cuando fui a Cabo San Lucas, y me decía: hay que ver las casas abandonadas. Que ya no existen casas abandonadas, existen casas ocupadas.
Pero esto sí es el proyecto del que usted estaba hablando en sus últimos comentarios, ¿no? Este proyecto de que con el gobernador de Baja California Sur, de que le decía qué hacemos con las casas abandonadas, y usted dice: ya no hay casas abandonadas, solamente hay casas ya tomadas, que eran previamente abandonadas. Esto es el proyecto que usted menciona, no solo para Baja California Sur, pero para todo México tal vez, o para varios estados de México, el ver qué se puede hacer con estas casas abandonadas y cómo se pueden llevar a un terreno beneficioso o para beneficio mutuo del Estado y de las personas que necesitan un lugar, un hogar. Sobre todo porque el costo de tener estas casas abandonadas en seguridad pública y en otro tipo de cosas puede ser muy costoso. Me gustaría si puede expandir un poco en estos casos.
Bueno, el fenómeno de las casas abandonadas se desprende a partir de la década de los 80 del siglo pasado. Es cuando cae el muro de Berlín y entra, es lo que nosotros le llamamos el neoliberalismo, como una reestructuración espacial, ¿no? Del idioma, la lengua, la ganancia, etcétera, etcétera, ¿no? Entonces, cuando ellos implementan programas con un perfil crediticio a los países que tienen un alto ingreso y una alta población en la economía formal, por ejemplo, como Estados Unidos, donde tronó esa burbuja inmobiliaria, en México se complica aún más porque la situación laboral es más precaria. Entonces, los intereses, los plazos, el costo de la vivienda obliga a que la gente tenga que abandonar la vivienda. Por ejemplo, te piden el 25% del ingreso para que tú lo pagues y se escucha bien, pero supongamos que cuando hiciste todo el contrato ganabas 20,000 pesos al mes, tendrías que pagar 5,000 pesos al mes. Pero resulta que si pierdes ese trabajo y después agarras un trabajo de 10,000 pesos, sigues pagando otra vez el 25% original, es decir, ahora tendrías que seguir pagando el 50% de tu ingreso. Por eso en un tiempo se usó en la jerga popular que en el Infonavit o pagas o comes, porque en efecto así era, ¿no? Entonces esto dio como resultado que la gente incluso que tenía economía formal, llegar a acuerdos con patrones para que no le dieran seguro social, sabiendo del riesgo que tenían en términos de salud con sus familias, porque eso permitía que no le descontaran el Infonavit. Entonces optaron por agarrar otra forma de convivencia laboral para evitar ese tipo de agresión. Y el problema a fondo sigue siendo el sistema crediticio del Infonavit, que no ha variado en un solo centímetro. Llegó al extremo que el INEGI sacó un dato escalofriante: 5 millones de viviendas abandonadas en México, que todavía lo siguen manejando porque no han actualizado. Ya no hay esos 5 millones de casas abandonadas. Ahora hay un problema de certeza en la posesión, pero el terreno está completamente minado. Es muy complicado la situación de la regularización de la vivienda, y entonces el asunto sigue dándose en las calles, ¿no? En los barrios. No hay una propuesta definida ni clara del Estado. La gente no se puede esperar a que ellos saquen un programa social que le den forma. Hay destellos, pero en realidad ahorita lo más avanzado que se tiene es lo de Sonora, Sinaloa y la posibilidad de Baja California Sur, en torno a las viviendas que fueron abandonadas y que ahorita están ocupadas.
El comentario de Alejandra Estrella me luce muy interesante, porque ella habla sobre el derecho constitucional para tener una vivienda digna, que es una frase que aparece en muchas constituciones en América Latina y sobre todo en México. ¿Y usted piensa que el gobierno de México está obligado para meter mucho más en la cuestión de vivienda, o está haciendo bastante en su vista?
No, el gobierno mexicano no mueve un solo dedo para resolver el problema de la vivienda. Ellos siguen en la lógica especulativa. En realidad, por ejemplo, ahorita el problema de las megaciudades es que deben de crecer hacia adentro. Hay mucha casa abandonada, no es necesario construir más vivienda. O sea, hablar de 5 millones de viviendas abandonadas, digamos, hace 7 años. Estamos hablando prácticamente de todas las viviendas que hay en Centroamérica. O sea, es enorme el número, ¿no? Claro, México tiene 26 millones de habitantes. Cuando el gobierno quiera resolver el problema de la vivienda, lo único que puede hacer es recurrir al derecho de expropiación por interés público. Cuando lo haga, entonces vamos a creer que están moviendo un dedo para resolver un caos que no solamente tiene que ver con un gasto a las administraciones, sino también un problema de seguridad. O sea, todas las casas abandonadas se convierten en nido de delincuentes, en núcleo de venta de droga, en agresiones de violación, asaltos, etcétera, etcétera. Es decir, no es necesario construir más viviendas, es necesario ocupar las viviendas que se encuentran ahorita para acabar con la alteración social que existe en el país. Y hasta ahorita, a casi 4 años del gobierno de López Obrador, no ha movido un solo dedo en esa dirección, a pesar de que es un reclamo nacional acabar con el problema de lo que eran las casas abandonadas, que ahora lo que se está planteando, darle certeza jurídica a la posesión de viviendas que estaban abandonadas.
La ciudad de Spokane, nuestra ciudad, es una ciudad que es menos de un quinto del tamaño de Hermosillo, por ejemplo. Pero también tenemos una cuestión de casas abandonadas. Aquí se llaman casas de zombie. También es una cuestión de oferta. Y todo el gobierno, los oficiales dicen que nosotros no tenemos bastantes casas, pero sí hay casas abandonadas. Y hay en la opinión de Félix, por ejemplo, hay comparaciones interesantes en estas cuestiones entre lugares tan diferentes, pero con problemas iguales.
Sí, en realidad la crisis de vivienda que hay en Estados Unidos, porque no es algo muy complicado explicarlo. La burbuja inmobiliaria del 2008 vino a poner al descubierto lo que eran los famosos créditos subprime, que eso los copiaron y los pasaron a otros países. Y ellos iban agarrados de la mano con un proyecto que se llamaba ciudades en expansión, o sea, construir mucha vivienda, y esos son los resultados de la catástrofe inmobiliaria que hay en todos los países que se implementaron ese tipo de este modelo. Y lo que lleva con ello, ¿no? O sea, fue una verdadera industria, ¿no? Donde intervenían que bancos de inversión, que la bolsa de valores, que altos intereses, que impusieron. O sea, es todo un engranaje que vino dando como resultado lo que estamos viviendo ahorita. Y no es solamente en México, en California, en Arizona, en Florida, en Costa Rica, donde se impusieron esos criterios. En Colombia hay un grave problema también. Entonces, por lo salió una frase ahí muy famosa de un ex tesorero de Grecia, que decía que en Chile necesitaron tanques, bayonetas y armas para derrotar a Allende, y que ellos nomás se lo jodieron con los bancos, simplemente con los bancos nos tronaron. Y entonces ese sistema crediticio, que no está basada en la productividad, entró en crisis, son altas ganancias, hay un circular de dinero en todo el mundo que no tiene una base de la productividad, y entonces generan este tipo de problemas que, si te vas al fondo, esa es la raíz, es la observación radical de por qué existe este desorden de las viviendas abandonadas.
Thank you very much, César. We will hear a lot more from César at the end of the presentations. We're going to shift gears and hear from our local panelists on issues closer to home. But I want us to think about some overarching issues here, differences and similarities in these respective crises. First, we're going to hear from Professor Matt Anderson. I introduced him earlier. He and I collaborated on this project, and Professor Anderson is going to give us kind of overview of the housing crisis in our local area. So, all yours.
Okay, greetings. Good afternoon, everyone. Glad to see all of you guys here. So first, I'd like to thank Joe Lenti for discussing with me the idea for having this event, as well as the willingness of our panelists to participate. So there's a lot that I would like to say here, and my head's going in sort of 10 different directions, especially after hearing these two presentations. So with like 10 minutes or so I have to speak, I'm going to pare down my comments to the causes of homelessness in the U.S., and of course we're experiencing a homeless epidemic of sorts here in Spokane, as well as the prevailing perceptions that people have of the homeless. And there's a lot to say as far as what I think we need to do differently to address this. But I will say that the prominent understandings that many people seem to have of the homeless is right up there at the top of the list of things that needs to change. The big one being that the homeless are all terrible, drug-addicted criminals that we should all be afraid of. The problem with this is, first, it's just simply not true. And second, if this is our collective understanding of the problem, then it's easy to presume that the root of the problem lies in the individual, some individual pathology, the decisions that they've made, which points to supposed solutions that are, of course, just as misguided as the diagnosis. And indeed, substance abuse is a problem. I don't want to sound like, this is not a problem. Yes, but it turns out that the past few decades of policy and practice have not really addressed the structural forces that really underpin this. And we know this. The literature is pretty clear on this. So what are the causes of homelessness today? Well, there isn't just one thing. It's a convergence of forces mediated by a variety of factors. It's complex. But the primary structural determinants, though, lie in basic housing and labor market dynamics. The wider the gap between incomes and housing prices, the greater the number of homeless people on the street. And it's not an accident that we've seen a massive jump in housing prices along with a jump in homelessness, with wages remaining relatively stagnant, especially at the bottom. The median sale price of homes has doubled in the past 5 years in Spokane. I think from $172,000 in 2016 to $332,000 in 2021. Incomes haven't gone up by that much. Of course, there are many mediating variables as well, but in a capitalist society where the mobilization of private property toward profit maximization is the primary force driving the housing market, and we're not making enough efforts to ensure that those most vulnerable to losing their homes can remain sheltered, then this is inevitable. The housing market has a lot to do with this, and a lot of it's a supply problem, the details of which I'm going to defer to the other panelists to discuss. So, there's a tendency to demonize, the homeless, but also we tend to complain about government not doing enough about this. But then many of us are also not willing to pay, any more taxes, for instance, to actually increase the government's capacity to do more, or tolerate the location of any affordable housing or shelter facility anywhere near where we live or where our businesses are located. So where are these people supposed to go? So first, what I want to do here is place this phenomenon within a broader historical context within the U.S., which I think is important, because it's rarely done, at least in the media. You can trace homelessness back centuries. This is not a new thing. But the form in which it takes today in the U.S., we can trace back to the 1980s, at least, when we see a shift in political ideology to neoliberalism, which was just a term invoked in the last presentation. What does that mean? The resuscitation of classic laissez-faire economic principles, minimal government intervention in the market, deregulation of the economy, finance in particular, privatization of everything under the sun, defunding welfare programs, and of course the importance of individual culpability. This becoming, institutionalized in the 1980s under the Reagan administration. And one of the things that Reagan does in the 80s is significantly pull federal funding to city governments. City governments used to receive much more in the way of federal funding to balance their budgets. But under neoliberal logic, why should we be funding cities for their own deficits, which was a serious problem at the time due to mass suburbanization and deindustrialization. Cities purportedly needed to figure out a way to generate their own revenues. Funding cities for their own deficits was considered a kind of welfare that needed to be done away with. Of course, at this time, we've only seen a massive surge in defense funding. So in many ways, this is an issue of priorities, right? So what happens is that cities had to begin luring businesses and people with money back to the city. And working with developers to enhance property values has been increasingly deemed necessary. Much more difficult to justify has been social welfare programs, subsidized housing, which we've pretty much gotten rid of entirely, or helping the homeless, as none of those things represent revenue-generating investments. Reagan also pulled a plug on funding many mental health institutions, which meant the spilling of mentally ill people onto the streets across urban America in the 1980s, which is right when we begin to associate homelessness with mental illness. So what have we done since? All we've seemed to do is make it more and more difficult to be homeless without committing a crime. Sit and lie ordinances, closing public parks after hours, no camping ordinances. We've essentially criminalized homelessness as a way to manage and control where these people can and can't be, with the goal of banishing them from visibility, especially in prime spaces of residential and commercial development. But they also need to be in close proximity to the services that they rely on, which have historically been located near such spaces of development, right? But there are more homeless people today, so these policies clearly have not targeted the root of the problem because they're not designed to. What we seem to be worried about is the visibility of homelessness. That's the real threat, it seems. So our approach to dealing with this has been to make it as invisible as possible, but not to actually end it. But of course, the problem is more visible now than ever, it seems. And another problem with this demonizing conception is that they're not all substance abusers or mentally ill. We often seem to just assume this. But there are just as many homeless people who are not addicted to substances or mentally ill. You tend not to see these people as much, though, as they tend not to be people on the street that are acting or visibly homeless. They often blend in with the rest of us. And if we don't see them, then it's as if they don't exist. And for those who do suffer from addictions of any kind, or for some it's the experience of being homeless that drives many of them to doing it. They weren't necessarily drug users before they became homeless. We tend to assume this was the reason, right, for why it happened. But how many times have we said, boy, I could sure use a drink, right? And we'll try being homeless. It turns out that this can certainly make you feel like that, perhaps more so than anything else. But if drugs are the cause, then how can we explain all the substance abusers that aren't homeless, right? Not every drug user ends up being homeless. And, so how can this be the explanation, right? It's not the explanation. It's a mediating factor, right? It's a big one. It's a trigger that can exacerbate one's vulnerability to becoming homeless. But the one thing these people tend to have in common more than anything else is that they're poor. Poverty is the real problem here. And all it takes is one big medical bill, some unexpected expense, being laid off, getting evicted, divorce, right? Or your car breaking down. And oftentimes it's something that people have really no control over. And if you don't have the kind of social network or support system willing or capable of taking you in when any of these things happen, well, just like that, right, you can become homeless. That's oftentimes how it happens. And we're now seeing growth in the working homeless, people who have jobs but don't make enough money to afford even the cheapest housing. I think as of 2017, I just saw this statistic the other day, if you were making minimum wage, you would have needed to work 69 hours a week to afford the cheapest rents on the market in the state of Washington. 2017, so we know what's happened since then. It's only gotten worse. So again, if everyone made the right decisions, right, we got rid of drugs, poverty would still exist, right, and those least fortunate would still have no option other than the street when such hardships happen. And that's really it, the inability to plan for and deal with contingencies when they arise, something that poverty exacerbates considerably. So yes, of course, we have shelters, but not nearly enough shelter space is available. Yes, oftentimes there are open beds, right? Many will point to that, but many homeless find the shelters to be less safe than the street itself, reporting theft, assault, harassment, sexual violence. And all it takes is one bad experience to sort of keep someone from returning. And it should be noted, too, that homeless people are more likely to be victims of violent crime rather than perpetrators. Okay, I think I have a slide to put up. Okay, there we go. So what can we do about this? So these are some of the more radical examples, I guess. There's a lot more to talk about here. And really, if I had 10 more minutes, right, we could get into this, but we can get into the discussion afterwards. But I will say that many other industrialized countries experience much less homelessness. Denmark, Norway, Finland, the usual suspects right in northern Europe seem to have a better grasp of this. So how are they able to do this? Well, many of these cities still receive national scale funding or benefit from much more prominent subsidized housing programs. There's way more socialized housing because it's much more invested in and people are willing to pay for it. Some of these countries have much more in the way of social safety nets, right? And they're less neoliberalized. And you also see more in the way of policies and programs that limit the commodification of private property. So in the end here, I think we have to decide what our priorities are, right? Are we willing to give up more to ensure everyone is sheltered? Does so much funding have to go to the defense, to military? If we're not willing to give up any of that, then we're essentially accepting in one of the most affluent countries in the world that some people must be subjected to living without shelter. But here we go. If we're placing the blame on the homeless themselves, well, it's easy to then absolve the rest of society of being culpable in any way. If we did nothing to produce this problem, then why should we be punished by having to pay more taxes, for instance, right? A sentiment that is much less prevalent in many other countries, in Denmark or Norway, for instance. It's also a sentiment that casts attention away from the monopolizing of low-income rental housing across the country by corporate landowners and large-scale investment firms over the past 10 years. Entities, I would say, that are among the most culpable today. Okay, so way more, I would say, needs to come from the top. And we have to recognize that the private sector is part of the problem here. The labor market's the other side of the coin. And the very existence of homeless people, unemployment in general, right, exerts a downward pressure on wages, which you also saw that in the last presentation, which of course benefits employers, especially the biggest corporations. Now, the Latin American experience, right, I think is clearly different in many ways. This issue exists kind of on a whole nother level, right? Though is ultimately underpinned by many of the same structural forces, lack of housing, affordable housing, and employment opportunities. But at least there, people are more or less allowed to build informal spaces of shelter. The moment someone pitches a tent here, anywhere remotely visible by anyone, then uproar seems to be the response. And because of this, then we make it illegal. So in a way, in some aspects of this, it's more punitive here. Now, I don't want to sound like we have to get rid of capitalism to solve this problem. Denmark and Norway are still capitalist countries, and there's increasing homelessness there as well. So I don't want to sound like it's some paradise, right? That's the example we need to turn to. But capitalism there is much more regulated. Neoliberal capitalism is is a big part of the problem that I'd like to emphasize. And would say that that's really what needs to change significantly. Otherwise, we're choosing a society where homelessness is going to be a problem. I don't think we can have it both ways. With that, I'm going to stop talking.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Anderson. We're going to turn the microphone over to Terry Anderson, who joins us from the Washington Tenants Union. And you can present from there, that's completely fine. And am I mistaken, Terry? Are you a graduate of?
Oh, yeah. Do you want me to just go ahead and start?
Sure. Yeah.
Hi. My name is Terry Anderson, and I am the director for the Spokane office of the Tenants Union of Washington State, and I'm also the policy director for the state organization. I love Mexico and Costa Rica because they have solutions that are just not possible here. I think that we have property rights and due process in property rights in our Constitution that causes some of the things that they are able to do that we are not able to do here. I would also want to add imbalance of power is probably one of the things that we see from tenants. So a little bit about the Tenants Union. We were founded in 1977, and we were actually founded as a result of an ordinance in the city of Seattle that banned single-room occupancy housing. Developers were eyeing downtown Seattle and wanting to convert those buildings and get the single occupancy housing out of downtown, and had convinced the city council that single-room occupancy housing was a blight, attracted drugs and criminal activities, and were terrible for neighborhoods, and it was just such a bad thing. They just had to ban them, and the city council of Seattle did ban them. But the one group they didn't really talk to were the tenants that lived in those buildings and the businesses that surrounded those buildings, who were very much a desirable alternative for affordable housing. And that is how tenants got together and organized. And you could see in their presentations that tenant organizing is a huge part in getting policies done. Unfortunately, in the United States and in Washington and in Spokane, the imbalance of power makes organizing tenants extremely difficult. When you are living in a unit and you know that the only way to organize the tenants in your building would be to organize and collectively go against your landlord, knowing that you could all get evicted, well, I can tell you right there, that kind of kills a good organizing campaign. So it's really hard to overcome that imbalance of power. I also would like to say that the top 100 cities in population in the United States have over 50% of their population are renters. Spokane may not be in the top 100 cities of the country, but we are very quickly approaching that 50% mark. So you can kind of say, generalize that about half of the city of Spokane rents their homes. You can't talk about rental housing without talking about racial disparity. I have lots of data in Spokane. About 80% of Black households are renters. Over 60% of Indigenous and other people of color households are renters. Yet 30% of white households in Spokane are renters. It's about 70% of white households are homeowners. So that racial disparity just gets wider and wider, because what does home ownership give you? It also gives you the ability to build wealth and pass that wealth on to your children. And when you're a renter, you do not have that. And so we have many. People talk about renting like it's a transitional part of your life. Oh, I remember when I was a renter for a few years. No, there are people in Spokane that are lifelong renters. Many, many, many tenants die as tenants to the point where we have state laws that actually have to address tenants who become deceased while they're a tenant. So this idea that it's transitional and everybody will eventually become a homeowner just is not true. And I can just say anecdotally, at the Tenants Union, we do organize tenants. We've had tenant meetings every month for years. And out of all of the tenants we've organized, I can just easily off the top of my head think of about 8 to 10 tenants who have become homeowners during that time and are now no longer tenants. None of them are people of color. Every single one of those tenants that we have organized in the past who are now homeowners are white. Again, making it very difficult. And here's the other thing. It's really tough to even address housing as a racial equity issue, because the demographics in Spokane, 30% of the white households that rent is still far larger of a population than the 70% of BIPOC households that rent. So it just isn't even viewed, except for BIPOC communities. Those of us who are BIPOC, we know that reality. But to convince other decision makers of that reality, it's very, very difficult. I know that there's also housing supply issues that Ben is probably more involved with, but from the impacted communities, the other difference is that housing is not a human right in the United States. In Europe, for example, if you're a squatter, they have to turn on the utilities in the unit in which you're squatting in, because it's a right to be there. In the United States, and this, believe me, during the pandemic, squatters' issues came up everywhere, to the point where you were accused of being a squatter even if you weren't a squatter, just because that was one way the landlord could evict you. So the moratorium, though there were protections in place, every protection, and you just have to know this, tenants don't have the ability to have lawyers evaluate their cases, so oftentimes they're alone or they lose by default because they can't even get a lawyer. Landlords, again, that imbalance of power, every tenant protection that we have loopholes, have exemptions, have waivers, have go-arounds, and landlords know this. So you still see tenants be evicted even though they pay their rent on time every month and they're obeying all the rules. You see tenants evicted, and one of the biggest cause of that is what we call, or I call, self-eviction. Tenants just get a notice. They don't know what the laws mean. They don't know what it means. They know that they heard about a friend of theirs that got evicted and now they can never get an apartment because of that one eviction that they had. And so they get a notice from their landlord, and that is sure homelessness for them. And they will move and become homeless voluntarily because they're so afraid of the eviction. Once they don't have a home and they're evicted, getting back in is almost impossible. So I would say that the biggest cause of homelessness in Spokane is lack of any protections that keeps renters in their homes. At the Tenants Union, we believe the best way to end homelessness is to keep people in the homes that they're already in. So I guess I could end there.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Terry. Okay, thank you so much, Terry. Moving along, we're delighted to have Ben Stuckert, who is currently the Executive Director of the Spokane Low-Income Housing Consortium, and, you probably know, former President of the Spokane City Council. So, Ben, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lenti, and thank you, Eastern Washington University, for hosting this. There's so many thoughts running through my head after listening to this, but from the 2008 economic crisis, my number was closer to 1,200 abandoned homes, and I think that's gone down to somewhere between 500 to 800 abandoned homes in the city of Spokane. But one time I brought up, because cities do have some powers, one of them is called eminent domain. And I remember sitting in a meeting and everybody was like, what do we do with these abandoned homes? And then the next meeting I attended, it was like, oh my gosh, our homeless numbers are up on the 1 year count, and we've got 1,200 abandoned homes, and then the next meeting they're like, we've got 1,500 homeless people, and you're like, we could use eminent domain because the banks are holding on to them and aren't negotiating and refusing to meet with us, and the looks in the room were like, you dirty socialist, what are you talking about? And it was brought up for the 3 years, my last 3 years in office, it was brought up that you dared, Ben, to mention using the tool in your toolbox in order to solve a problem, because it's just such a private market that we live in that is so different than other communities, and it's the Wild West, right? It's individualism. And I just remember that meeting, and it still sticks with me. The city attorney just announced he was retiring, and when I talked to him last week, he brought that up. He said, do you remember when you brought up eminent domaining those houses? I'm like, well, there's homeless people living on the street and there's empty houses, and to me it just should meld together. And I want to thank Professor Anderson, because literally my page of notes are exactly what Professor Anderson said, and so I'll try not to repeat, but I'm going to give maybe a little different angle on that. And I thank Terry for all her work. She has been tireless for the last 10 years that I've known her, for representing tenants in our community, and it is thankless work, and she does a really good job. She just works hard every day for our community. So in 2018 for the city, they sent me to Copenhagen for 8 days, this private foundation, to teach us about environmentalism in Copenhagen. And I remember and they try to wine and dine you because they want you to bring all their ideas back. And I remember after dinner the first night, we were walking, and we had to walk or bike everywhere in Copenhagen because it was environmentally friendly. And we walked like 3 miles home through the heart of downtown, and we turned to each other when we got to the hotel, and we're like, there are no homeless people here. So I'm like on my phone, is Copenhagen that small of a town? Nope, Copenhagen's the size of Seattle. So we're there for 8 nights, and so me and my friend, we made it an effort every night after dinner. We would bike or walk around town, and I'm doing research like the worst neighborhoods in Copenhagen. Where is the homeless population? And we went everywhere. And we found all sorts of interesting things in Copenhagen, but we found 5 homeless people in 8 nights, searching, desperately searching. They have 20% of the housing stock in Copenhagen is public housing because housing is considered a right. It's not rocket science. Homelessness is a housing problem. So, in addition to my role as executive director of the Low Income Housing Consortium, I'm also chair of this board, and it's called the Continuum of Care. And the Continuum of Care handles over $5 million a year locally for homelessness prevention services. And we're trying to figure out what other cities have done. And there's only 2 big, large cities in the United States over the last 10 years that have seen a sustained decrease in homelessness. And one of them is Houston, Texas. They've seen a sustained decrease of 64% over the last 10 years. And you know what? Everybody we interviewed, I spent 4 days in Houston and we filmed people. Every single person we interviewed had the same story. They built housing. They built 8,500 units of permanent supportive housing, and they've housed 25,000 people over the last 10 years. And that's because they have a healthy rental market that people can move out of the permanent supportive subsidized housing. So housing is like a continuum, and it's a ladder, right? You got ownership, you got rental market, and you got low income subsidized housing. And you want people to, if you have a healthy market where everything is reasonably and affordably priced, somebody will move into low-income housing with services, and then they'll move into maybe low-income housing without services because they don't need them anymore. Then they'll move on to market-rate apartments that they can afford. And then maybe if we do it right, which we don't do any level, we have a housing crisis in Spokane where home ownership has increased by 50% over the last 24 months. Rental rates in Spokane have increased by over 50% in the last 24 months. And the wait list for low-income housing in the city of Spokane or in Spokane County, 3 years. So if I'm homeless in Spokane and I do everything right and I get assessed and they say you really belong in low-income housing that has services, the wait is 3 years. Like, think about that. Our system is so messed up that you have to wait 3 years. So, Houston got it right, they built housing. Copenhagen gets it right because they consider housing a right. But we continue to blame the individual. But there's actually, like, we can say things and say that it's a housing or use a example, and when you use examples in argument, they're like, well, that's just one anecdote. But it's like the only city that's decreased housing. So let's look at studies. In 2018, Zillow did a study, and they said for every $100 increase in rent, it increases homelessness in a city by between 5 and 10%. So then, their argument's going to be, well, Ben, that's Zillow. That's not Harvard. Okay, so let's look at Professor Colburn from the University of Washington and Clayton Alden, who's a data journalist that worked for Pierce County, wrote a book this year that just came out last month. The title of the book is that homelessness is a housing problem. And they looked at 30 cities across the United States and looked at poverty rates, they looked at education rates, they looked at early childhood learning percentages, and they looked at rents. And the one correlation they were able to draw in those 30 cities, because you have similarly sized cities like Cleveland and Detroit who have low levels of homelessness. But similar sized cities like Portland, Seattle, San Francisco have high levels of homelessness, yet their poverty rates are the same, their childhood education rates are the same. The difference is the rental rates in Seattle and Portland and San Francisco are higher. So if you have high rents in a city that people can't afford to live in the housing in the city, you have higher rates of homelessness. Homelessness is a housing problem. So why are rents so high in Spokane? Why have they risen 50% over the last 24 months. And it's a basic supply problem. And I'm going to say something that's pretty controversial. And the Growth Management Act, which if you're an environmentalist, you love the Growth Management Act. It said we're not going to sprawl out anymore. But it had an unintended consequence, because what the Growth Management Act says is we're not going to let you sprawl out, but it said we're not going to mandate that you have density inside your cities. We're going to let you decide for yourself. And cities, when left to their own devices, want the status quo. Somebody that lives in a neighborhood in your city moved into that neighborhood because it's exactly like it is when they moved in. They do not want poor people in their neighborhoods. They do not want apartments in their neighborhoods. Spokane is 70% single-family zoned, which goes back to one of Terry's point. Single-family zoning, if you don't know the history of single-family zoning came out in 1916 in the city of Berkeley. They passed a law because they didn't want a black-owned small business in the city of Berkeley. The state Supreme Court of California said that's racist. So what did they do? They invented single-family zoning for the sole purpose of keeping black people out of neighborhoods because they couldn't afford to purchase homes. Our whole zoning structure in the United States has its history in discrimination. So when we say people, and you can look at maps of Spokane right now, where the concentration of wealth is where the white people live, and it matches the areas from the 1930s when we had redlining. It all exists for the same purpose, which is to have 70% of our BIPOC community as renters and not owners. But it perpetuates and continues to perpetuate the homeless problem as well. Because when neighbors don't want apartments or low-income housing in their neighborhood, it keeps them single-family zoned, it stops mixed-income neighborhoods, and then you're able to treat people like others and blame them for the problems instead of the system. And if we had more mixed-income neighborhoods, which is why public transportation is so good, because if you hop on a public bus, you see people of all different races, all different income levels, and you're forced to deal with each other, and it's much harder when you're around people to otherize them and blame them for societal problems. NIMBYism is the name for not in my backyard, and that's what we have. Why apartments are not being built in Spokane, and why we do not have density in Spokane. But it's also why we have a shortage of supply of apartments. And the Growth Management Act and the state needs to say, if we want the Growth Management Act to be environmentally friendly, then they have to mandate density inside our cities. And then lack of low-income housing. Why is there a 3-year wait list for low-income housing? 75% of funding at the federal level was cut in the mid-1970s for low-income housing, and that has never been made up. In Spokane, in particular, 30% of the low-income housing was lost when we redid downtown in 1972 and 73 in order to build Riverfront Park in the lead-up to Expo 74. We never replaced those. We lost another 30% of our low-income housing in the 2008 bubble. You remember places like the Otis in downtown Spokane and the single-room occupancy buildings. Those were lost in the bubble because they were turned into condos. And those have never been made up. If you have no money and you're not building enough low-income housing, you can't get people out of homelessness, which is why it's getting worse. So you have homelessness increasing because we have a shortage of market rate apartments, then rental rates are skyrocketing and there's no protection for tenants. And then once they end up on the streets, you can't get off the streets because there's a 3-year wait list on low-income housing. We have the ability to solve this. Did you guys all know that the ARP, the American Rescue Plan, put $100 million in our county commissioners' pockets and $80 million in the city of Spokane's pockets? Last March of 2021, you know how much of that has been expended in the city of Spokane? 0. You know what Pierce County and the city of Tacoma did? They said, we're going to fix low-income housing and try to solve our homelessness problem. So they set aside half of their funds, almost $100 million for low-income housing, and all that money is building low-income housing in Pierce County and in Tacoma right now. And they're not doing that in Spokane. It's not a revenue problem right now. We could solve this, but it's only getting worse. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ben. And lastly, and please don't forget that after this final presentation, we have the best part of any roundtable, the Q&A. So stick around for that. Next is a good friend, my neighbor, Brian Jennings, also happens to be development director for the Spokane Housing Authority. So, and Brian has a presentation as well. So, thank you, Brian.
Use this one. How's this? Any better? Well, I have all the answers, so good thing I'm here. Yeah, I work for the Spokane Housing Authority. We were formed in 1972. We have a board of 6 commissioners, 2 from Spokane Valley, 2 from City of Spokane, and then 2 from the county. We manage all the vouchers. So if you've heard of Section 8 here today or the voucher program, we manage those in 6 counties in eastern Washington. So there's over 5,000 of those that we provide to tenants who then use them, and that voucher, if they're only capable of providing, say, up to 30% of what they make to rent the unit, the voucher makes up the difference for whatever the rent is. So. But I'm not going to get into that too much because that's not my specialty. I'm the housing development director. I'm going to talk today kind of about a tool we use in the United States that's been around for a number of decades to develop affordable and low-income housing. We use it here in Spokane, and as you'll see as I get into this, it gets a little technical, but I'll try to make it as clear as possible for you. But so with that, I want to open up. Do I just say advance or something, or raise my? Oh, there's a clicker. Look at that. Too much power here. And there's a laser pointer. All right, there we go. So first thing, quiz, everybody. I'm going to show you some photos. I'll give you plenty of time, but I want you to pick the low-income housing. Okay, everybody seen that bridge? This is Spokane, just that hill just up above. That is Kendall Yards right up here, if you haven't seen that. The gondola runs right through there. This is a shanty town that was existing in Spokane, just right down from downtown for a number of years. It was disassembled and people were asked to move on. I believe this is from the 30s. I'm not sure. This is an affordable housing project in Seattle, actually, for artists. But I want you to pick the others. Tell me what you think. Affordable housing or not? No ideas? No, that's affordable housing. How about this? This is in California. Affordable housing, you think? Looks pretty nice. Who'd want to live? Would you mind living there? You needed an apartment? That is an affordable, low-income housing project, actually, in California. This one, affordable housing or not? Yeah. Yep. That one actually is a project, an early version of a project here in town, one of the Bachhaven. That's permanent supportive housing for formerly homeless. How about this one? Affordable housing? Not. That's affordable housing. This is actually was built out in the valley. This is an early rendering of the project for families out in the valley. And this one, originally not affordable housing, probably became affordable housing. I think this is Seattle. I think this might be. Sure. But it's currently affordable housing. And this one also, I think this is somewhere in New York, I'm thinking. So, the point is everybody has an idea of what, when we develop low-income housing, what it looks like, and it doesn't really look anything like what you might think it looks like. So what is housing? This is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Everybody's familiar with this. If you're here at the university, I'm sure you've taken a Psych 101 class. This is a different version of it that I think my children might have some sense that you need Wi-Fi, and below that is a battery that actually lasts for your iPad. In terms of what low income is, and I'm sorry, but these figures didn't really, it's hard to see. But when we talk about low income housing, it's percentage of the area median income. So area median income in Spokane, anybody have an idea what it is? It's up there. I'll give you a clue. It's right there. For a family of four, a household of four, it's $77,100. That's 100% of the median income, meaning half of the population makes more than that, half makes below. If you're an individual, it's $54,000. These are 2021 numbers. We consider low income to start right around 80%. So these numbers, 61,000, 43,000, you can see in very low income, extremely low income. If you're an individual, you're making 16,000 roughly. A family of four is 20,000. So when we talk about low income housing, we talk in these income bands when we're doing development for that. That really drives everything. And the main tool we use is something called low income housing tax credits. If you've done your income taxes, you completed them yesterday. If you have children, you received last June, July, you received, I think it was $1,500 per child from the federal government. Usually that takes the form of a tax credit when you do your taxes at the end of the year. But it's something similar here for what we use for these low-income housing tax credits. They were originated in 1986. Just to give you a flavor of what was happening in the country in 1986, these were the top 3 movies. Top Gun, which Top Gun 2 is coming out this year, hopefully. COVID kind of threw a wrench. Platoon, as well as Crocodile Dundee, the original, not number 2. I think that there was a third, but I didn't see it. President Reagan was in office and he signed this into law. And this didn't exist before, but really what it allows is a dollar for dollar reduction in tax liability. So if I'm a big bank, I don't want to pay a lot of taxes. That's just the way it is. Just kind of common, like a lot of people feel the same way. So they can use this tool. They can invest in an affordable housing project and reduce their tax liability dollar for dollar. So they'll buy into our projects. They'll become an investor. They'll own 99.9%, actually 99.99% of the project. We'll own 0.01 of it. It's a partnership. And they come in and they actually bring in a lot of money up front, and in exchange for that, they're able to write off their tax liability and reduce their overall taxes for 10 years. They have to stay in the partnership for 15, but for 10 years, they can reduce their tax liability. In exchange, we get a huge amount of investment up front to build the project, and we're able to rent it out for 15 years. A lot of times there is an extended period. Like most of our projects will have a beyond a 15-year, more like a 30-year, sometimes 50-year obligation to keep it affordable, right? So all those projects you saw up front use this mechanism more than likely. It's different from a tax deduction, and that's what makes it so attractive. It doesn't just reduce your tax bill, it actually reduces, it actually is a dollar for dollar reduction on your overall taxes. So big banks like it, big investors. This kind of illustrates sort of how it works in terms of a deduction versus a tax credit. I won't get too much into the weeds on this, but basically it's something that's seen as real beneficial if you're a corporation, actually a bank, financial institution. But these projects take a long time to pull together because they have layers and layers of funding. You have to apply for the credits, you get the credits, you have to start the project within a couple years. Once you're finished constructing it, that's when the tax credits can be claimed by the investor. And then we, as the 0.01 owner, 0.01% ownership, we have to maintain compliance with that. So we have to report on that annually. There are restrictions, like I mentioned. It has to be low income. We can't rent it. We verify everybody's income when they come in, and we continue to monitor it and verify that they're not making more than what the unit area median income target is set at. So pretty intensive management, but it's for a good purpose. Some statistics. Using this program, there's between about 90,000 to 100,000 rental units produced annually. Since the beginning of this, there's been about 13 million estimated number of people who've rented these units across the country. It provides a large number of direct jobs, construction, property management, all of that. In terms of private equity leverage, between 1987 and 2015, it's estimated over $100 billion of equity. And the foreclosure rate on these, that's why the investors like these so much, is because they're so well managed. The foreclosure rate is less than 1% historically. And they raise over $3.5 billion in multiple layers of taxes each year from these developments. We did a project in the Valley that actually was the Valley, and then we combined it with two other projects where it was already low income, but we recapitalized it. I mean, we went in, renovated it, brought in an investor, outside investor. The Valley portion of it, and I spoke to the Valley City Council about this, was about a $20 million construction project just on a renovation of 200 units. So all those jobs that were created, all of the tax that was generated from sales tax for building materials, everything, that actually benefited the city of Spokane Valley. Let's see. This is basically a definition. That red text down below, I have it here. Without the incentive, affordable rental housing projects don't generate sufficient profit to warrant the investment. This is a real simple. That shouldn't be a plus sign. It should be a minus. But on market rate projects, when you see them developed, they bring in the blue a certain amount of revenue. They have certain hard and soft costs that the revenue is there to kind of offset and provide cash flow to the investors in that project. When you're talking about affordable housing, low-income housing, the rents just aren't there. So you need this outside investor to come in exchange for those tax credits, because the revenue just doesn't offset that, and it doesn't cover the cost to construct it when you have to borrow those funds. So that's why this program generates so much interest. Since 1986, I think I mentioned that, almost 3.1 million. This is a map I did. It shows all of the low-income, the projects that have used this tool across the United States. Each triangle represents a project. This is Washington State. There's Spokane over here, Seattle, I-5 corridor. You can see even some of the smaller towns, Dayton, Walla Walla, Kennewick has a number, Yakima. They're all over the place, and so it's not just concentrated in one area. This is Spokane. This is a couple years old, this map. There have been a few more that have popped up around here, but you can see the number of projects that have used this. With that, who's involved in it? A project like this, you'll have the investor, the outside investor. You'll have nonprofits who actually do this development. You'll have developers who may be a nonprofit. Cities can bring in funds, usually counties, state government. They monitor and regulate the tax credits. And then the federal government's involved as well. So a lot of players. Basically, the idea is that the tax credit program addresses that market failure, that there's a substantial lack of quality affordable housing in these communities. So the idea is, and the reason the program exists, is if we can harness private sector business incentives to develop, manage, and maintain affordable housing for lower income tenants, then we're better off. So, there you go. That's it.
Okay.
Thank you, Brian. Now I'm going to turn it over for just an open-ended question and answer session. If you have a question, we're going to ask that you go to one of the two microphones here. And please remember that we have our translators are working furiously to translate behind the scenes. And that's a difficult task. So maybe if you can keep your questions concise and short is always better. We can pose them to some of our Latin American panelists as well. So yeah, please feel free to ask a question if you like. Do you mind coming to the microphone? Yeah. Thanks.
Hi, thank you for being here today. This question is about Spokane questions, so for the people at the panel today. It seems we're dealing with a series of short-term and long-term issues when it comes to affordable housing. Currently, there are 300 people at Camp Hope on I-90. It seems the barriers in the way to secure low-barrier spaces, pallet housing, and maybe even additional WSDOT compliance camping grounds is being held by an administration unwilling to listen to a council. How can, let's say, 50 voters or volunteers in this room make sure that that $60 million you talked about is actually used to help this short-term crisis down on I-90, and eventually, I guess, alter zoning in the Growth Management Act?
So I just spent the last part of this on texting back and forth because the administration, in order to give themselves cover for the 250-person warehouse, asked the continuum of care to vote yes on it, and we're trying to come up with a compromise that we're having a special meeting tomorrow because 250 people in one warehouse with cement floors is not best practice for shelters. And I saw a copy of the lease yesterday, and the lease actually mentioned barbed wire. So if we think about warehousing people, that's warehousing people. I think you should probably, if you want to make a difference, plan on showing up at City Council at 6 p.m. next Monday, expressing your concerns, but I think there'll be a fairly decent compromise in front of them, at least within the next 2 weeks. But it's really very sad when we had twice as many people in 2021 die on the streets as we did in 2020, and they've had the American Rescue Plan money since then and haven't spent a dime of it. So you need to, and it's better than emailing them is to go and talk to them in person because that's televised, and the more people hear you out in the community as well, the more other people are emboldened to speak their truth as well.
And where is that at what time?
City Hall, which is at 808 West Spokane Falls Boulevard, at 6 p.m. on Monday.
Thank you.
I would also like to add that all of the organizing to address the homelessness situation in Spokane, I think one of the things that's been missing is to enact policies to prevent homelessness from growing as it has been for the last 10 years. The tenants union and tenants that we've been organizing, the tenants union has 4 walk-in tenant clinics. We have a state hotline, so tenants call our offices when they have issues with their landlords. And then we contact those tenants and ask if they want to join and get involved with the campaign. Now, many, like I said, are very reluctant to do so because they called us because they're afraid they're going to get evicted. So it's very hard to do, but I have been urging those who are advocating on homelessness issues to remind City Council that there are ordinances that they have been considering for 7 years that have not been enacted. And some of those will help keep people in their homes so that they won't become homeless, and some of those ordinances will make it easier for people to get into housing once they've been homeless, like universal rental applications, things that won't cost tenants so much money. We've got landlords that literally make a huge profit just off of all the rental applications that they receive. We would like the city of Spokane to do something to limit that, because we literally hear from homeless folks that say, well, I can only apply for 3 apartments a month. because that's all the money I have to submit rental applications. So included in homelessness advocacy should also be tenant protections so we can stop the growth of homelessness. Thank you.
Thank you. If you don't mind, we have questions coming in online, some of them directed toward our Latin American panelists. So sit tight. But next we have a question from Ty McBride. He writes, what ways can the average person help combat homelessness? And I'd like to hear from some of the panelists that we have beyond those we've heard from. We actually have quite a few individuals from Mexico who have some perspectives to share and can answer some of these questions for us. So if you don't mind, Juan Soltero Sanchez would like to answer this question.
Muchas gracias. Me escuchan ahí, yo creo, ¿verdad?
Sí, pero no lo veo. Espera.
Ah, ok. Espérame un segundo. Tal vez ahí me ve. Ahí debo de aparecer.
No, aún no lo vemos.
Ah, ya. Un segundo. No, ahí debe de aparecer ya. ¿Sí? Muchas gracias. Yo participo con el compañero César del Pardo en la Organización Central Unitaria de Vivienda. Y conforme a la pregunta de cómo puede una persona común ayudar al problema de los que no tienen casa, y lo estaba leyendo en el chat, no sé si esa sea la pregunta.
As far as the answer, to answer the question that was being asked, he would like to go forward. Sí, ¿puedes dar la respuesta, Juan?
Sí, la respuesta yo creo que sería en general, nosotros nos podemos enfocar en diferentes formas que el Estado tiene para poder dar una respuesta.
Juan, ¿me puedes dar la respuesta por teléfono mejor? Porque no podemos hablar los dos al mismo tiempo.
Ok, está bien, yo se las pongo en el chat nada más.
No, dime la respuesta por el teléfono, ponle mute a Zoom y yo ya puedo comunicarle al resto.
Le pongo mute al Zoom.
En Zoom.
Ah, ok. Ya. Ahí está. Bueno.
It's a little tricky.
Okay.
It's kind of a multimedia, multinational presentation. Okay. Juan, we're going to return to you in a second.
Por el teléfono.
Sí, ahí te voy a dar la respuesta ahora sí.
Felix, let's return to Juan in a minute and maybe hear from one more question before we come back to him. Thank you.
My question is regarding median income and low income and the definitions. Do you know how many people are making median income, like percentage of the population versus percentage making low income, very low income? And why do we determine low income, like affordable housing for people that are making 80% of the median income and 60% versus, why is that the bar, I guess?
HUD sets those figures, and those are, I believe, federally determined definitions as to what substantiates a low income and extremely low income. Basically, I think they look at the population and look at the population